good. That's my boss. And she felt a Chinese face will be needed to make this topic more promising. So here I am. And my parents did a really good job on building my Chinese face. In this trip, I met my cousin a few days ago. She's studying in Monash University for her master's degree. She was surprised by the fact half of the class are Chinese. Of course, there are Chinese students all over the place. Today, there are 100,000 Chinese students living in Australia, and representing 25% of all overseas students. This is actually a consequence of a growing economic relationship between China and Australia. So if you look at data, China today is the sixth biggest foreign direct investors in Australia. So what happened? Why suddenly we see the capital and the people all coming to Australia? So to understand this, we have to understand the three shifts in China: urbanization, the rise of middle class, and opening up. So let's look at urbanization. Shenzhen is one of the four biggest cities in China, as you can tell from this picture. There are 15 million people living in the city today, and the property price is same as Melbourne. So can you imagine 30 years ago, there are only 300,000 people living in Shenzhen? So Shenzhen is the developing of Shenzhen is really the microcosm of China's urbanization. In 30 years, people living in city increased from 18% to 55% today. So keep the speed, we will see 350 million people moving to city in 15 years. This is more than the population of the United States today. And in this process, 7 new Beijing will be created. So this change in China also creates interesting and unique phenomena in China, which we call the tiers of the city. And as you can tell, the difference between images, the wealth is unequal distributed across different cities, and we put the cities in 4 groups. In the tier 1 city are Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. So their GDP per capita is very close to GDP per capita of Brazil. And then we got second tier, like Xi'an and Chengdu. Their GDP per capita is close to Indonesia, and they are usually 30% cheaper than in terms of living costs compared to tier 1 city. There's even tier 3 and 4 are lagging behind. So many people see the opportunity of 7 new Beijings. They are aligning their business strategy with it. However, they often forget tier 3 and 4 also represent large opportunities. Taobao, the largest online shopping website in China, their data shows tier 3 and 4 cities represent 58% of smartphone sales in their channel. In average spending perspective, tier 3 and 4 also leading tier 1 and 2. The reason that the poor city and the lagging behind infrastructure really stop people to buy things from physical store. So they turn to digital channel for their favorite brand. So our suggestion is dual strategy is really important in such scenario. And your existing product today can work really well with tier 1 and 2. However, you need to be more innovative and adopt frugal innovation for tier 3 and 4. So the second shift in China is the rise of middle class. So I read the news from Guardians November last year. China's Singles' Day was blamed for the shortage of formula milk shortage in Australia. At the time, Australian parents are anxious about their baby's food. there are thousands of sellers on Taobao selling Bellamy's milk. And Chinese tourists, overseas students are back buying those products and shipping them back to China. And I have to confess, I'm one of them. I brought 10 cans formula milk for my baby, and I have 6 in my luggage today. So Chinese consumers today, with the rising of the middle class, are demanding better products and services. And the growing number of this class really created the tension between demand and supply. So in year of 2000, there are only 4% of the people living in the city considered as middle class. But today, the number is 70%. So with the growing class, the Chinese product cannot satisfy them anymore. They want something authentic and turn to Australia for answers. They want black mole pills, they want UGG shoes, and of course, they want Bellamy's milk. So this emerging class also created 2 interesting markets in China, leisure and health. So taking health as an example, in 11th of November, we call it the Singles Day, which is similar as the Black Friday in many countries. Sellers on Taobao sold 30 million Australian dollar worth air cleaner in one day. The air pollution in China and the raised awareness of health from middle class created the 30 billion market every year. And this market will become 200 billion in 2 years. So I wouldn't have enough time to elaborate leisure. I would happy to do that in tonight's event. But the question I want to put here is understanding the Chinese middle class is actually very difficult due to the size of the country, the tiers of the city, and the cultural difference between the South and North. So our suggestion here is you need to learn from the local experts and also change your mindset from made in China to made for China. So the third trend I want to talk about is the reform and opening up. Last year, our President Xi Jinping sealed free trade agreement with Australian government. That means there are more areas are open today for Australian business. So this is not an ad hoc change. If you look at Chinese history, Chinese government actually put open as one of the 5 key themes in our 13th 5-year plan. So we will see more and more structural change happening in the next few years, including price formation, taxation, demonopolization. All this point to a direction of more competitive market mechanisms. So this opening environment actually challenges the regulation. Taking peer-to-peer lending as an example, Chinese government published the regulation policy last year, 5 years behind the first company started its business. 4 years ago, when we started working with Ping An Insurance, the missing regulation was the biggest single risk for the success of the project. However, be able to land market early not only helped Ping An Insurance to become the most successful player in the market in peer-to-peer lending space, but also it helped them to gain incredible credibility in front of the government and help them to set up the regulation policies. Believe it or not, the Chinese government is actually quite open in many areas, especially the emerging areas. So our suggestion is to network with insiders and changing the stereotype of government and also learn to work with them. So I talked about the 3 trends in China and how will those trends impact Australian business and you. I will hand over to my boss.
Thanks. So, I mean, the numbers really do tell the story. In the areas of business and in trade, China is just the biggest game on the planet. In almost every measure, they're the largest, and they're still growing every single year. And from an Australian economic perspective, our future is inextricably linked to our neighbours. And today, any Australian business looking at expanding beyond our own borders has got to be looking at China. But it goes further than that, because over the next 2 to 5 years, countries in the ASEAN region are going to be presenting us with opportunities that will be increasingly difficult to ignore. Now, China is already Australia's biggest trading partner in both directions, import and export. But it's the export part that is massively dominated by iron ore and coal today. And when the conversation goes on about the slowing of China's growth and the impact of that slowdown on Australia's economy, that slowdown is also dominated by iron ore and coal. Beyond that, the opportunities around the increasing appetite of the Chinese consumer for Australian goods and services, that part is continuing to grow. And quite frankly, that's the part I'm excited about far more than iron ore and coal. Partly because Australia is already a really compelling lifestyle brand in China, with brand attributes like clean, quality, safety, fun, health. These are attributes that can be applied to so many different domains of goods and service, of things that we might think about taking into that market. They're also mapping really, really well to the two concepts that Hukai talked about, to those emerging markets around health and around leisure. I thought it was kind of fitting that the one that Hukai didn't have a chance to talk about, he suggested that you catch up with him over a drink. Those two things seem to match quite well. So we have a huge opportunity. We have a very strong, compelling brand in China. We have a huge and growing appetite for consumer goods and services. And we have a real opportunity to take advantage of. So how do we actually get there? How do we take advantage of this appetite and this innovation? So Hukai's talk provided, I guess, a backdrop to the drivers behind this. And it's become clear to me that for both China and Australia, it's an exciting partnership with potential upside that's huge for both parties. At the moment, there are huge opportunities in aged care, in financial services, in agriculture and food, and also in domestic tourism. So we think a lot about the tourists that come to China, but the growth of the leisure market means there's a huge amount of domestic tourism in China as well. And Australia's got a pretty good track record when it comes to thinking about the tourist market. Keep in mind as well that this is a market so large, or as Hukai said, a series of markets so large, that a segment that could be considered, I guess, too niche, too small to worry about here in Australia, could have huge upsides in China. I remember this became enormously apparent to me when I was living in India a few years ago, and I was in a bookstore in front of a quite large section of books entirely dedicated to financial planning for medical doctors. And when you've got over 1 million medical doctors, I can see that as a pretty compelling segment, but in Australia we don't quite have 100,000, so I'm not sure it's that huge a segment here. But it's that kind of mindset we have to start thinking about. And I've been working closely with both China and India for over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and I am still staggered every time by the numbers. Because I grew up in Australia, where we have this tiny population with low density that's kind of far away from the rest of the world. And that shapes your experience of the world. It shapes the mental models that were talked about earlier today. And it shapes the way that you think about opportunities and often constrains them. So how do we think beyond that? How do we use all of these opportunities of interaction with markets like China to stretch and add to our mindsets of how we interact with the world? And this is doubly important because not only is there a huge consumer appetite for Australian business to take advantage of, but there's a huge opportunity in accessing the innovation that's happening in China. What can you learn about your business and your products and your services in this very large, very different market and repatriate back here, back to Australia, where you can actually bring that to your current markets and your current customers. And what could you learn about your journey into China today that puts you in a really good position to take advantage of the other emerging opportunities in places like Thailand and Indonesia over the coming years? So recently there was a report that came out that said Australian businesses should look at experimenting, at testing the market in China using e-commerce. And Real Estate Australia has done just that recently with the MyFuncom website. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's a version of REA.com that is dedicated and focused on the needs of wealthy Chinese buyers looking at purchasing Australian property. And Hukai is going to take us through a little bit more of the detail of what that journey looked like. But since the launch of MyFun, REA has enjoyed, I believe, a 47% increase in site traffic and an 88% increase in revenue from Asia. So I'll hand over to Hukai, who can take us through a little bit more of that.
Look, my boss asked some really good questions here.
Thanks.
Yeah, my boss was right. Our MyFuncom is a big part and a strategic move for realestate.com.au. And MyFuncom not only contributes to the market success of the company, but also builds really good technology reputation for realestate.com.au. So David Anderson, a senior marketing director, actually tested REA's MyFuncom, and he found REA avoided all the common mistakes a Western company would make when they first come to China. And he put all his fundings into an article called How REA Group Cracked China's Internet Rule Book. So I feel really proud when I saw this article, because that means the work we have done has really good quality. So overall, I think REA did three things extremely well when they enter in China. They go beyond translation, and they continuously improve, and also they do service enhancement really well. So many people will say, you are the leader of Australia, and China is lagging behind. Just translate your website, put it in China, people will rush for that. This is wrong, because entering China means you are helping your consumers living in China seeing your business through their lens. It does also mean you need to run your technology from a very different environment. So I was in Sydney airport and seeing airport securities yelling at Chinese tourists in English. So people are terrified and confused. How would they understand? The same mistake could happen in business world. How will you speak same language as your consumers? Taking REA as an example, there are 20 property types in Australia. However, in China, we have 5. So what will you do? Will you educate your consumer the difference between the property types? So REA made a decision to put consumer in the center. So they actually map the 20 tabs to 5 tabs Chinese people would understand, and reflect that change to software and change design for that. The REA's change, I think it is a great story to learn from here that going to China is more than just translation. And every business should learn from here, and especially in the technology part, is similarly important. So if you oversimplify this process, you will have so many oops in your journey. For example, how will your consumer find a website from Baidu? Many people never heard of that. And how will your consumer trust your website rather than thinking that's a phishing site? And how will your consumer see the image, because that can be blocked by GFW? So we are doing assessment from assessing channel and data, all this perspective on the solution before actually entering China. I recommend all Australian business should do similar assessment before they go. Second thing RE did really well is the continuous design and improvement. We can see the difference between two pictures. The left side is China. So it seems the Chinese consumer has very different behavior compared to Australian consumers. Chinese consumer using selection more than search box. So think about that. This behavior, this change actually makes sense because only if you know the location you do search, else you would browse for content. So it is always great to learn the different from data, but how do you end up with this right solution? So we work together to look at popular design patterns in China, put it together, and narrow down to a few, and pick one of them as our experiment. And if you are familiar with Chinese website enough, you will see this pattern repeated a lot in many popular websites. Of course, it works really well for REA. So I think there are 4 core capabilities for Australian business to adopt when they go into China. The first one is land, and measure, and learn, and pivot. So land means you need to go China as quick as possible and do just enough preparation rather than iterate every possible scenarios to collect the real customer data, because you will always find something new and something surprising you from the market. Second one is measure. You need to get the capability to learn from the data, and especially in the context of many of you familiar tools will be missing. For example, Google Analytics. The third one is learn how to empower the local talent and find the unlimited choice to feel that you can always pick up probably the better solution from that. In our case, there will be hundreds of ways to filtering information, and we're leveraging the local talent to narrow down to few and find the right one for us. The last one is pivot. So how can you make your change to website more quickly? Remember, your Chinese competitors are working in a style. They call it the 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. So far, we get the website work properly in China, but it doesn't mean we provide the seamless end-to-end consumer journeys. Think about how Australian people search for property. They will search property, view the property, and contact the agent. It would be wrong if you think same thing would work in China. Actually, a typical Chinese consumer's behavior looks like this. They need to learn something. They need to learn the financial constraint, legal constraint, and the good neighborhood first. And then they do a search, they view the property, and then they need to share the property with the families to have a discussion. And their family member could distribute it between China and Australia. And then they want to listen to some suggestion from local expert to narrow down the choices even further. And finally, they reach out to the Australian agent, either by themselves or by their relatives or sons living in Australia. So we have to find the different first, and identify the different process and pull this process into the software. The reason REA can do this so successfully is they know the secret of leveraging the local talent. So my suggestion is go to China, see the environment, talk to the people. That not only help you to build knowledge, but also build great empathy between you and your team. And that is critical to encourage collaboration. And so I talk about the experience of REA. So how do we take experience from here and apply that to your work? You have anything to say?
You didn't say boss that time. So there was a survey recently of Australian businesses that had actually been to China. And 70% of those surveyed said it was either more difficult or much more difficult to do business in China than it was in Australia. So there's not a lot of folks walking around saying, this is totally simple, you should just go and do it, don't think about it at all, just run. The same survey showed that the primary barrier, and by a really big margin, was the very human one of local language, local culture, and local business practices. And it's those human challenges that I think mean that we need to take that customer-centered approach, that we need to think about putting the Chinese consumer at the center of the process that we're talking about. Because if you don't, how else do you find out things like, in China, a lot of purchasing decisions are a family affair. Organizations that understand that can design the service in such a way that reduces the friction of collaborative and collective decision making. Those folks are going to have a massive advantage over the organizations that don't understand that and think that buying a house or buying any kind of significant purchase is similar to what it is here, which is I pretty much make my decisions and go and do them, and I might tell my parents afterwards, but they're not really part of the decision. So another source recently has been talking about the fact that before entering China, you need to be fully prepared and fully committed to fully assess your markets, to fully assess your risks, and to find yourselves a partner that is open to fresh ideas and fresh thinking. And I like parts of that, and other parts of it I'm not so sure about. So firstly, I think finding the right partner that is not only open to fresh ideas and new thinking, but will bring you fresh ideas and new thinking, allows you to actually switch the idea of fully into one that I think a lot of folks here are familiar with, of just enough. So how do you work with someone that can help you take an approach of just enough preparation, just enough assessment? Because if you can enter the market quickly on that just enough basis, you can then start collecting real data in a way that Hukai talked about, and making decisions based on reality rather than simply by research before you go into the country. And it's important also to point out that just enough is going to be different for every single one of you. REA did have a little bit of a head start on this. They'd been working with both our Australian and our Chinese teams for probably a couple of years before going on this journey. And that meant that they'd spent meaningful time in China. And they had built trust with a team in China. It's not to say it's going to take you a couple of years to get there, but they did have a head start. So what are you going to do to start accelerating your journey? One of the points I would suggest, though, is that when we're thinking about starting this journey, you don't just have to think about going to China. We have a huge inbound opportunity that we can also explore, and that's possibly an easier first step for some of you to have some of those lessons. So Hukai talked about the 100,000 students that are here. We also have about 1 million inbound tourists from China every year. They spend about $7 billion on food, on shopping, on accommodation. And as you could probably tell from the excellent rain this morning, we've just passed our peak tourist peak for the year. So the peak amount of tourism spending, $7 billion. How many of you know how much of your recent revenue came from that segment? How many of you know how those people shop and interact with goods and services in their own countries so that you can take advantage of those patterns in thinking about your strategy to access that consumption when it's inbound to Australia? Just some things to think about. Hukai mentioned, I've mentioned the importance of actually going to China and starting to experience this for yourself. I mentioned that every time I go, I learn new things and I have new insights. Hukai, obviously, when he comes to Australia, learns that irreverent humour is kind of okay in a business setting, which is our new one. But I can't understate that enough. Being able to actually go and physically and emotionally broaden and add to the number of mindsets that you can use to think about business problems and think about opportunities for your organisation is really important. So it's enormous. The opportunity and some of the effort to go with this, mentally enormous. So you do need to think about it. It's complicated, it's challenging, it's really, really different. But there are ways to approach this, to be able to take that experimental approach, the land, the learn, the pivot, the expand approach. And the opportunity, the upside is so great that all of the things that you'll go through to get there, the learning that you'll learn, what you'll learn about your organization on the way, what you'll learn about yourself on that journey, it's really, really worth the effort. So in closing, I think the only question I've got left for you guys is, what are you waiting for?